The sun beat down over the tarmac of Falcon Military Airfield, casting long shadows across the rows of aircraft that stood silently under the blue sky. And among them, the Blackhawk helicopter gleamed like a beast waiting to be unleashed. Its rotors motionless, its cockpit reflecting the bright morning light. Standing beside it was an elderly man, shoulders slightly hunched but eyes sharp with a lifetime of experience. His hands folded behind his back as if he were still on duty, even though many years had passed since he'd last worn the uniform. This man, Samuel Reed, was a decorated Navy veteran who had flown rescue and combat missions that younger pilots still read about in training manuals. But despite his achievements and despite his unmatched skill, he now stood on the sidelines, banned from even touching the aircraft that had once been an extension of his own body. A few feet away, a group of younger officers gathered, their voices low but their smirks obvious, and one of them, a confident man in his 30s with a neat suit and aviator sunglasses, stepped forward, pointing dismissively at Reed. "You can't even start that." "Old-timer," he said with a laugh, loud enough for everyone to hear. Several others chuckled, some out of arrogance and others out of discomfort, unsure if they should join in but unwilling to challenge the man who held influence within the airfield's administration. Reed didn't respond. He simply kept his gaze on the helicopter, the machine he knew better than most people knew the homes they were raised in. He felt the sting of their mockery, not because of the insult itself, he had endured worse on battlefields, but because it symbolized the new world he was forced into. A world where experience was undervalued and age was seen as an expiration date. The reason he had been banned from flying was simple yet unfair. After a minor maintenance incident that wasn't even his fault, the administration decided he was too old, despite medical reports proving he was fit and capable. They didn't want liability, didn't want someone his age showing up the younger pilots, didn't want to face the uncomfortable truth that skill didn't always come from youth. Reed's chest tightened not from anger but from helplessness, because the Blackhawk wasn't just a machine to him, it was years of memories. Missions, sacrifices, brothers lost, lives saved. A connection no one around him could truly understand. As he stood there, the airfield bustled around him, engines roared, tools clattered, officers barked orders, but his world felt strangely quiet, as if everything had slowed down. He thought back to missions where every second counted, where he had flown through storms, gunfire, and impossible odds. He remembered the faces of soldiers he had pulled from danger, the sense of responsibility, the unspoken trust. And now, after all of that, he was reduced to being a spectator. The young officer in the suit, Lieutenant Harris, walked closer, circling around Reed with a smirk that barely hid his insecurity. Harris had always been threatened by Reed's legacy, afraid that stories of the veteran's accomplishments overshadowed his own ambitions. "They should have retired you a decade ago," Harris sneered. "These birds aren't made for relics." Reed finally turned his head slightly, his jaw tightening, his patience thinning but still intact. He wasn't the type to fire back with insults. He believed in respect, even when it wasn't given to him. But before he could say anything, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the tarmac. The group of officers straightened instantly, their expressions shifting from casual arrogance to rigid professionalism. Walking toward them was Admiral Jonathan Price, a man known across multiple branches for his strict standards, sharp judgment, and almost intimidating ability to see through people. Price had served with Reed years ago. The two shared a history that younger officers didn't know, a history written in missions classified so deeply that most personnel would never learn about them. The Admiral's presence changed the atmosphere instantly. Conversations stopped, tools were set down, and salutes snapped into place as he crossed the tarmac with precise, deliberate steps. Harris quickly stepped forward, trying to appear in control. "Admiral Price, sir," he greeted with forced confidence. "We're preparing the Blackhawk for demonstration." just ensuring everything is under proper supervision. Price didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved past Harris and settled on Reed, his expression unreadable but not unkind. For a moment the two veterans simply looked at each other, an entire decade of shared experience passing between them without a single word spoken. Reed felt a surge of old familiarity, memories of missions they had flown side by side, times when trust meant survival. Then Price shifted his attention to the Blackhawk and finally spoke. "I heard there was an issue with authorization," the admiral said calmly. Harris swallowed, suddenly uncomfortable. "Yes, sir. We've restricted access to certain personnel for safety reasons." Price raised an eyebrow. "Safety reasons?" Harris nodded quickly. "Yes, Admiral. Especially considering, well, some pilots are no longer fit for operational handling." He gave a subtle glance toward Reed, hoping the Admiral would take his side. Price paused, then stepped closer to the helicopter, running his hand lightly across its exterior as if examining it. "This aircraft," he said, "has survived storms, firefights, emergency landings, and missions most wouldn't dare attempt." His voice grew firmer. "And one man here has flown through all of those conditions and brought his crew home every time." Harris stiffened. "Sir, with all due respect." Price held up his hand, silencing him instantly. Then he turned fully toward Reed. The tension in the air was thick, everyone silently waiting, unsure of what the Admiral was about to decide. Reed stood still, his posture straightening unconsciously, the disciplined instinct still alive in him. Admiral Price looked him over, not with doubt, but with assessment, as if evaluating a soldier ready for duty. And then, after a long moment, the Admiral spoke the 5 words that would change everything. Words that sliced through the arrogance, the restrictions, the unfair ban placed on a man who had given his life to service. Words that made every officer on the tarmac freeze with shock. "Give this man the controls." Harris's face drained of color. Several younger officers exchanged stunned looks, unable to believe what they had just heard. Reed blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Price stepped closer to him, lowering his voice but keeping it firm. "Show them what real flying looks like." The air around them seemed to come alive. After years of being sidelined, mocked, treated as obsolete, Reed felt something spark inside him, something he thought he had lost. Confidence, pride, purpose. Without waiting for approval, because the Admiral's word was all the approval needed, Price motioned for the crew chief to open the helicopter. The man didn't hesitate. He unlocked the cockpit door and stepped aside. Harris stuttered, trying to object. "Admiral, you can't just, this goes against protocol." Price didn't even look at him. "Protocol exists for safety," he replied sharply. "Not ego." Harris fell silent, his authority collapsing. Reed approached the Blackhawk slowly, each step feeling like a return to a forgotten world. He placed his hand on the metal frame, feeling its familiar temperature, its power, its history. This was home. This was where he belonged. He climbed into the cockpit, his movements steady and sure, as natural as breathing. The seat welcomed him like an old friend, the controls fitting perfectly beneath his fingers. Everything felt right. Everything felt alive again. Outside, officers gathered around, watching with disbelief, curiosity, and a growing sense of awe. Price stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but proud. Reed flipped switches, checked gauges, and the Blackhawk hummed to life. The rotors began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, each rotation cutting through the air with purpose. And as the helicopter roared to life, everyone realized something undeniable. The old-timer didn't just remember how to fly, he hadn't lost a single bit of his skill. The rumble of the helicopter vibrated through Samuel Reed's bones, awakening a part of him that had been dormant far too long. And as the blades spun faster overhead, the air around the Blackhawk whipped into a frenzy, sending dust swirling across the tarmac and forcing several onlookers to shield their eyes. But Reed didn't notice the commotion outside. His world had narrowed to the cockpit, the controls, the gauges, the steady rhythm of a machine he knew as intimately as the lines on his own hands. His fingers moved with confidence, flipping switches and adjusting levers with a precision that came from decades of experience rather than recent practice. Every sound of the engine, every vibration beneath his feet, every reading on the instrument panel made perfect sense to him, like a language he had never forgotten. Behind the glass of the cockpit, Reed's reflection stared back at him, older but filled with determination. And in that moment he felt something powerful: purpose, a sense of belonging, a validation that no amount of bans or insults could erase. Outside, the younger officers watched in stunned silence, no longer smirking, no longer doubting. The man they had dismissed as old-timer had brought a Blackhawk to life with the ease of a master craftsman picking up his tools. Lieutenant Harris's jaw tightened as he realized his authority, his arrogance, was being dismantled in real time. He stepped closer to Admiral Price, trying once more to salvage his pride. "Sir, this is unnecessary. He's been out of active flight for years. The risks are—" Price cut him off sharply. "The only risk here," he said, "is underestimating a man who earned his place in the sky long before you knew how to spell the word aviation." Harris's face flushed, embarrassment and anger battling for dominance. But before he could reply, the engine roared louder as Reed powered up the rotors fully. The helicopter lifted slightly, testing the ground effect, and all conversation stopped. The Blackhawk hovered just inches off the ground, perfectly stable in Reed's command. The crew chief watching from below blinked in disbelief. Even with constant training, not every pilot could hold such a steady hover. But Reed made it look effortless. He eased the helicopter down again, locking the skids back onto the tarmac. Then he opened the cockpit window and looked directly at Admiral Price, awaiting instructions like he had done countless times before. Price nodded, a small but unmistakable gesture of approval. "Take her up," the Admiral said plainly. Reed's heart thudded in his chest, not from fear but from exhilaration. This wasn't just a demonstration. This was vindication. With a deep breath, he lifted the collective, adjusted the cyclic, and the Blackhawk rose gracefully from the ground, climbing higher with controlled momentum. Wind whipped past the airframe as the helicopter ascended, and the officers below grew smaller, watching in awe as the veteran pilot they had mocked soared above them with the mastery of a man half his age. Harris stood frozen, unable to comprehend how the situation had turned against him so completely. The helicopter leveled off at a safe altitude, and Reed guided it across the base with smooth, confident movements. Each maneuver he performed felt like reclaiming a piece of himself that had been unjustly taken away. He circled once, twice, executing a perfect bank turn that left several of the younger pilots speechless. Then he performed a maneuver most of them had only attempted in simulators, a precision nose-down descent before leveling, seamlessly back into a hover. The talk across the tarmac shifted from disbelief to admiration. "He's incredible," one of the younger officers murmured. "I didn't think anyone his age could fly like that," another whispered. "Age doesn't fly helicopters," the crew chief said quietly. "Skill does." Up in the sky, Reed felt the emotions he'd bottled for years begin to surface. Memories of missions flooded back, stormy nights over the ocean, desert rescues under enemy fire, medical evacuations where seconds meant the difference between life and death. He remembered the faces of soldiers who had trusted him with their lives. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the adrenaline, the unbreakable focus. But most of all, he remembered the pride in being part of something bigger than himself. The airfield shrank beneath him as he pushed the Blackhawk forward, feeling the smooth responsiveness of the controls. Everything felt exactly as it used to. His hands knew what to do even before he consciously thought about it. As he flew, Admiral Price watched with an expression few could interpret, part satisfaction, part nostalgia, part unspoken respect for a man who had served with honor. Harris, however, felt something different: dread. He had built his authority on the assumption that Reed was outdated, incapable, unfit. But watching him fly so flawlessly shattered that foundation. Harris knew that when the Admiral made his final report, it would reflect poorly on him and his judgment. The helicopter completed another wide loop before descending gently back toward the tarmac. This time, Reed didn't hover. He executed a precise, textbook-perfect landing. Not a single skid bounced, not a single adjustment faltered. It was flawless. As the rotors slowed and the engine purred into a quieter idle, Reed shut down the systems with care, his hands steady, his breathing calm. When he finally stepped out of the helicopter, every pair of eyes was on him. But now there was no mockery, no doubt, only respect. Admiral Price walked forward, and Reed straightened instinctively, old habits resurfacing. Price studied him for a moment, then broke into a faint smile. "Still have it, Sam," he said. Reed returned the smile softly. "I never lost it," he replied. Harris stepped forward reluctantly, trying to salvage the moment, but the Admiral's attention snapped toward him before he could speak. "Lieutenant Harris," Price said sternly, "your evaluation of this pilot was flawed at best, disrespectful at worst. You made decisions based on assumption rather than ability." Harris swallowed hard. "Sir, I was only thinking of safety." "No," Price interrupted. "You were thinking of your ego. And ego has no place around aircraft or the men who fly them." Several officers glanced nervously at each other. Harris's humiliation was now public and undeniable. Reed, however, didn't smile at the reprimand. He wasn't a man who enjoyed watching others get torn down. Instead, he focused on Price. "Admiral," Reed said quietly, "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted a chance to fly again." "And you earned that chance," Price replied. "The ban is lifted. Effective immediately." The words hit Reed harder than he expected. For years he had accepted the possibility that his flying days were over. That no matter how capable he remained, bureaucracy and bias would keep him grounded. But now, hearing those words from the Admiral who once trusted him with missions most pilots would refuse, he felt a swell of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. Several officers approached him, offering congratulations, albeit somewhat awkwardly. Even those who had doubted him now viewed him with newfound respect, not because they were told to, but because they had witnessed his skill with their own eyes. Harris lingered behind the group, conflicted, shamed, but also grudgingly impressed. Reed didn't address him, didn't gloat, didn't demand an apology. Instead, he simply nodded at the younger man in quiet acknowledgement, a gesture that carried more dignity than any words would have. The sun had shifted in the sky by the time Price placed a hand on Reed's shoulder and said, "Walk with me." The two men moved away from the group, strolling toward the edge of the airfield where the noise of engines faded into the distance. "Sam," Price began, "I didn't come here just to intervene in that nonsense. I came because there's something I need to discuss with you." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Something serious?" "Something important," Price replied. "There's a classified operation in discussion. It needs a pilot with your experience. Someone who can handle high-risk conditions. Someone the younger pilots simply can't match." Reed stopped walking. The air around him felt still. "Admiral." "I'm retired," Price said, "but not done." Reed hesitated, torn between the desire to serve again and the weight of his age, his responsibilities, his sense of closure. Price sensed his hesitation. "Just hear me out," he said. "We don't need you for combat. We need your brain, your instincts, your understanding of how to maneuver in situations where failure isn't an option." Reed exhaled slowly. What kind of operation? Price looked him directly in the eyes. One that could save lives before the world even knows they were in danger.